The ridge breathed a thin, cold breath before dawn. Wind ran fingers through the pines, tugged at the hems of skirts, lifted loose ashes from yesterday's hearths, and pushed them like small dark birds down the slope. Far below, Red Mesa Ridge cut the sky into jagged teeth. The village clung to its hem like a moth to a lantern, small lights clustered and dimming as the world brightened. On the narrow trail that led from the mission into the higher passes, a single figure moved with the steady purpose of someone used to walking between lives. Elena Morales carried her supplies in a satchel at her hip. Small jars of salve, rolls of linen, a tin of boiled water kept hot against the chill. Her hands were more used to the chalk she left on blackboards than to blades, but she had learned to knot a bandage and to press a fevered forehead with the same gentle steadiness she used when teaching letters to children. The ridge suited her. Its silence, its honesty. It offered no excuses and no pretense. It delivered truth in the blunt currency of cold and stone. She walked thinking of the schoolroom. She thought of a boy whose breath had rattled like old tin, of a woman who could not stop the cough that ran her thin. The mountain air filled her lungs until each breath felt like a small victory. A pin of sunlight caught on the rim of a bottle, and for a moment the ridge seemed gilded, as if the world had been rearranged to a sharper order. The path narrowed. A hidden clump of cedar and low scrub, brittle with late frost and the rasp of wind, leaned imperceptibly into the trail. Elena did not hear it until her boot caught a jut of root. Her weight went the wrong way. There was a quick, ungainly shift of balance, a gasp that did not belong with the dawn. Her skirt caught on the jagged twig. The cloth snagged and tore a shallow line. Then a small jagged shard, split wood, resin-laced and cruel, found the inner curve of her thigh. Pain was a bright, immediate thing. It hurled her to the path, breath gone, the air a hard thing pressed into her chest. Warmth pooled where the shard had lodged. The cloth darkened and clung. For a moment she was only animal, hands pressed to a wound, brow furrowed, the world narrowed to the hot point of hurt. She called out. The sound scattered along the ridge like a stone thrown at glass. The mountains answered with wind and the distant call of a hawk. Elena had never imagined that the small things, the snapped limb of a shrub, the brittle edge of a wintered branch, could so quickly change the trajectories of lives. She knew the proper modesty of treatment, to keep dignity as complete as possible, to expose only what necessity allowed. She lifted her skirt a little to see the wound. It was shallow by the standards of something that might take a life, but deep enough for fever to find purchase if the soil stayed. There was blood. There was the old grimy texture of the past clinging to her skin. She told herself to breathe. She told herself she could manage until the mission sent someone with fresh bandages. The figure that came up the path did not appear like the village. He walked as if the ridge were his parish and its problems his work. Quiet attention in his step, a lean in his shoulders from years under sun and wind. Isaac Calder had the sort of hands that showed their owner's life at a glance, calloused, stained at the fingertips with smoke and the black tang of saddle, nails trimmed but not manicured. His face was lined by weather. His eyes were the color of a late autumn river. Flat, honest. He carried no mantle of heroics. He carried a leather satchel and a small knife. When he saw Elena he paused, not with the rush of someone who would make a claim to rescue, but with the measured assessment of a man who had counted the cost of each wound he had seen. He knelt in the drab light of morning without ceremony. He spoke only to ask if he might help. She nodded. The language between them in that moment was as simple as two neighbors bartering sugar for salt, need and offer. His hands moved with quick authority. He warmed the tip of the blade by the flame of a small match he struck against his boot. The scent of heated metal and resin lifted into the cold air. He pressed aside the ragged edge of the torn cloth and eased the splinter free with a motion that was careful and final. Elena clenched her teeth and breathed through the edge of pain. When the stick came out, she cried out, a short, sharp sound that startled the mountain. Isaac wrapped the place with linen and pressed until the flow slowed. He murmured something, an instruction perhaps, or a small prayer, and Elena felt the first thread of relief spool into place. There was an intimacy in the act that was entirely practical. It was hands doing necessary work in the absence of witnesses, a decision to place life above propriety. Elena felt both gratitude and the old prickling awareness of exposure. She had lifted her skirt only enough for the wound to be tended. Isaac's gaze rested on the place only as long as it needed to, and then returned to her face. From the rise above them, silhouettes appeared, 3 figures moving with the clumsiness of men who had been walking to market and stopped because they had seen something they thought legible. They caught the last bright sliver of light on the blade and the lift of a skirt and the shape of a man bent low. Their seeing was fragmentary, their sense-making immediate and cruelly simple. From that height a single image can harden into a narrative. A kneeling man, a lifted skirt. Even the wind seemed to carry the wrong emphasis, press the wrong syllable into tongues below. A whisper began almost before the men had stepped onto the slope. It was not a voice so much as a direction, a thought given to air. From one throat to the next it slid, growing teeth and color. By the time it reached the edge of the village, the whisper had sharpened into accusation. That single whisper climbed the ridge faster than any horse. It threaded through the alleys and the market spaces, nudging other small fears awake. The harvest had been lean that year. The children's shoes were thinner. A cough had taken 2 of the older hands. People in the village did not seem to have the bandwidth for nuance. They had enough for certainty. The innkeeper told the blacksmith what he thought he'd seen. The blacksmith, who had lost a brother to a fever he could not name, took the shape of the rumor into his own past and returned it fortified. In the small square by the well, a group gathered, faces made into masks of sudden righteous indignation. Words were thrown as if they were stones. Impropriety, scandal, what is done in the open with stealth. The rumor needed hardly anything to thrive. It fed on the village's brittle hunger for someone to blame and something to feel clean about. Isaac felt it first as the hard weight of someone's gaze when the men on the rise puffed and called something indistinct. He stood and looked up, saw the 3 figures, and then the small crowd gathering, and understood with an awful clarity how a single image might be reshaped. He did not speak loudly. He folded the leather satchel under his arm and let Elena rise with his help. There was no wave of applause, no thankful crowd. There was only the moving miasma of gossip seeking shape. By the time they reached the mission, the whisper had translated into claim. Elena kept her head down. Sister Clara met her at the door with the slow, exact tenderness of someone who had wrapped more than one human life in linen. She observed the bandage, the tightness at Elena's jaw, the way she refused to meet any eyes too long, and she understood that the wound had become more than flesh. There were questions on the parlor table before their cups had cooled. "What happened?" one woman asked, voice a thin lantern flame. Elena told it plain. The fall, the shard, the pain, the man who offered help. She did not add the sort of flourish that rumor likes. She did not blame. She said what needed saying like one reading from a ledger. But the ledger had already been written by others. Her words were small pins trying to tack down a loose thing. Outside, Sheriff Thomas Rourke had been coming to the mission on a separate matter. He was a broad-shouldered man whose duties had taught him the value of being the one who knows how to keep a town from unraveling too quickly. He had come to secure a stray herd a week before, to listen to a complaint about livestock, to tell a man to mend a fence. He had a face that found no ease in softness. His hands were used to the weight of a badge's chain and the weight of decisions that left him sleepless. He arrived to find questions strung together like beads. Men from the square were there, all breath and accusation. Sheriff Rourke listened more than he looked. He had a memory of a brother who had been accused in a different town of a sin he had not committed, and the traces of that injustice were a rawness in the sheriff's chest. He had learned there are moments when caution is not cowardice, when caution is duty. Precaution, he said, because it was a word both clinical and neutral enough to wear the judgment of his office. I will speak to the man. No harm in asking what occurred. Isaac's hands were empty when the sheriff spoke to him. He did not make a show of pleading. He told the sheriff his name, that he had been on the ridge with tools for mending a fence and had heard a cry. He said he had cut out a splinter and bandaged her. The sheriff nodded as if sealing a fact into his book. Yet there was an edge in the sheriff's gaze that told Isaac the town's thought had already run ahead of him. For the sheriff, being cautious meant being in the middle of a rope. Pull one way, and a town rallied for righteousness. Pull the other, and rumor swelled into violence. So Isaac was taken to the small cell behind the courthouse, not with cuffs or spectacle, but with the quieting hand of an institution that feared what might happen if it did nothing. For your safety, the sheriff said, though it was not only Isaac's safety he had in mind. The town wanted order and a decision. Sometimes the appearance of action is its own solace. Meanwhile, Father Julian Herrera sat alone in the dim back room of the chapel, candlelight making the lines of his face softer, more uncertain. His habit hung on him like a map of old roads, tears where time had frayed him, the faint smell of incense in the collar. He had seen many things in decades of tending souls: children given up to frost, men whose teeth chattered with drink, women whose stubborn stitches could not hold a life together. There had been a time when his silence had been a choice he thought virtuous. In the memory that coiled in his chest, there was a boy who had bled longer for want of a voice to say otherwise. Years ago, a neighbor had whispered of a man in a door. The priest had chosen privacy over intervention then, thinking some matters belonged behind the thin curtain of confession or the private sorrow of the heart. That silence had cost the boy his life. The thing had lodged in Julian like a burr. He had lived since then with the knowledge that a cleric's quiet could sometimes be as fatal as any blade. He touched the wooden rosary at his wrist, as though to test for prayer or atonement. He did not think of himself as heroic. He thought only of the weight left by the past and of the small simple ways truth might be restored now. The wound he saw, were it true in its nature and its treatment, was evidence enough. An incision and bandage speak in mortal language that can be read without a seal. A priest is bound to keep confessions. He is not bound to accept gossip as gospel. He had to remember the difference. Around the village, houses had closed their shutters with a certain finality. Children were kept indoors. Elders gathered in doorways, hands folded, eyes moving fast as hawks. The economy had been tenuous all year. The town's sense of itself had been under strain. A rumor promised a clear target to focus their unease. In such weather, compassion can harden into blame because blame asks less and offers the illusion of control. Sister Clara, Elena's closest companion at the mission, moved like a blade of grass bending to shelter another. She had the soft competence of someone who had mended lives along with fabrics. She supported Elena with hot teas and tightly knotted bandages. She refused to pronounce the whispers as anything more than wind that would pass. Her face, however, held the worry line of someone who knew small kindnesses could become accusations in places eager for certainty. Elena sat with her hand steady, though the quiet at the mission felt like a held breath. She thought of the children she taught and their simple, unblinking trust. She thought of the boy who had laughed last week because a letter finally made sense to him. She had come to the ridge to do a thing of mercy, to give schoolbooks and salve. Now she felt like a thing under scrutiny, the tender part of her a target. The wound hurt not only in the flesh but in the way the world preferred drama to fact. At the courthouse, Isaac rested against the cold stone and found his fingers fidgeting for the satchel he had left on the bench. He thought of small things, how the satchel had a patch seam from a long-ago repair, how his hands knew the exact pressure to ease a splinter free. He had not expected gratitude. People sometimes offer a curt nod and then return to their tasks. Sometimes they remember nothing at all. He had thoughtlessly believed that tending to someone's body would translate into tending to their reputation. He had been young once in his certainty. He had been fewer years since then. Sheriff Rourke walked the line between public expectation and private conscience. He had been raised on stories that explained violence away with a single name. He had been forced, by memory, to recognize the cost of such narratives. When he looked at Isaac, he did not see a villain. He saw a man who moved like a person accustomed to working alone, whose small acts of mercy might be misread. Yet he also felt the weight of what would happen if the town's anger came down the ridge like a storm. The whisper continued its work. In the tavern, the cook scrubbed kettles and rolled the words of the rumor around on his tongue, seasoned them with indignation. At the smithy, the blacksmith fitted boots for a regular customer and let his hands shape the story into something that conferred righteousness upon him. Whispers gratify. They allow the anxious to feel they have acted without acting, to feel clean by denouncing. But even in the harshness of that early hour, not everyone fed the rumor. A woman who sold herbs waited at her stall and watched the sheriff's men walk past. She remembered, with a careful tenderness, the debt of kindness she had owed to strangers who had once nursed her father through a fever. In the corners of the market, where conversations were softer, some voices urged caution, not from cowardice, but from the exacting knowledge of how hastiness rends a community. Father Julian rose from his chair and straightened the stole at his neck. He could not undo the past. He could, however, decide not to compound it. The memory of the boy was not a ghost to be excused. It was a tutor. If words had been withheld once and a life had ended for the silence, he would not let the same pattern play out again in a different key. He had a duty to the truth that was not the same as breaching a confidence. He had seen Elena earlier, the bandage at her thigh, the precise incision. He had no right to violate what was revealed in a confessional, but he had the responsibility to speak to the facts he had observed. Still, speaking carried cost. There are reputations so brittle that anyone who steps to break the prevailing wind finds themselves shrugged aside. There are times when the one who corrects a crowd is accused of dividing it. Julian thought of his own quiet. He thought of the last time he had held his tongue and the price it had exacted. There was a way to testify to what was true without performing priestly adjudication. Simple facts, the language of wounds and of care. He wrapped a shawl about his shoulders and stepped from the chapel into the air that smelled of embers and pine. The ridge lay like a spine above him, and the whisper crawled down it, and he felt the thinness of the town's peace. He did not rush to the square. He walked as a man unhurried by the need to prove himself right. He walked because truth, when delayed for long, thins into doubt, and must be put back into the bloodstream of a community. At the mission, Elena sat beneath a window that looked toward the pass. She could see, in the distance, men moving in a line that might have been the sheriff's patrol. She thought of the children who would come to her school, of their small, clear eyes that expected honesty. A slow anger, not at any one man but at the small cruelty of quick judgment, warmed in her like a coal sheet. She did not want reprisal, she wanted the hum of ordinary life, the children's laughter, the clack of pots, the steady rhythm of people who neither elevate nor destroy one another at the turn of a rumor. When the sheriff's messenger came to take a statement, she answered plainly. The words were small and precise. He came, he helped, she said. He did not do more than what hands are meant to do. I was in pain. I needed assistance. He gave it. The messenger wrote, eyes down. There were hands on that page that might become the town's ledger of fact, or else its smudged, uncertain record. Even as facts were set down, the town's mood hung like a thin ice over the well. People murmured in doorways. Mothers clutched shawls around their children tighter. Men who had been quiet in their griefs found in the rumor a ready cause to lift their voices. When Isaac learned he would be detained for precaution, he gave a small, rueful smile that did not reach his eyes. There was no bitterness in him, only the quiet acceptance of someone who had seen how the world fit and did not assume it was always kind. He sat down on the bench outside the little cell and thought of the ridge. He thought, not of fighting, but of how often the small things, broken fences, a splinter, a misstep, could pull a community's threads taut until they frayed. The sheriff closed the ledger with a soft smack. He left Isaac to his quiet and walked out toward the square where the people gathered. Thomas Rourke had a face that told of a man learning to carry an old wound with a new humility. There was a time when being the sheriff meant wielding authority like a blunt instrument. That time had thinned. He now understood that stewardship meant sometimes owning the town's mistakes as much as enforcing its laws. At the edge of the square, a crowd had formed that was less a mob and more a congregation of grievances. Faces pressed forward, eager for pronouncement. They sought the safety of someone's judgment. They wanted to be right. In that hunger for rightness, truth can get lost beneath the footfalls of certainty. Father Julian walked into that hush like a man who knew the cost of silence. He saw in the faces the same hunger for absolution a town often mistakes for justice. He remembered the boy who had died decades earlier, and how silence had been its accomplice. He did not intend to play prosecutor. He intended to return the facts to the place where they belonged, in the open, where they could be weighed and not whispered. He did not know what he would say yet, only that saying was a work of mercy as necessary as binding a wound. The chapel's musty quiet had prepared him. The memory of lives left tender by neglect had steeled him. He would not shout. He would speak simply and clearly. The crowd too was ready with its own sentences. If only we had known sooner. If only someone had stopped them. The words assumed a shape and a target. The town pressed for a culprit, and the human mind is terrible at restraint in times of fear. As Father Julian stepped forward, the wind took up the whisper again and let it travel like a low, unsteady drumbeat. It was the same sound that had started at the pass, now grown to the size of a rumor, now gathering the weight of a town's unease. People leaned in like those who hope to catch the last fragment of a story before it slips away. The sense of waiting was heavy and sharp. Inside the mission, Elena rose and straightened her bandage with hands steadier than she felt. She thought of the ridge behind her and of the man who had saved her without asking for a thing in return. She did not know whether the town would forgive him quickly or whether the nearly violent tendency of small communities would crush him. She had learned, these last years, that mercy sometimes asks of people a cost they are not willing to pay, the cost of a name, the cost of reputation. She had learned also that a person could choose to bear that cost if it meant keeping another from harm. Her thoughts turned inward, to the roots of why she had come to the mission, to the quiet conviction that seemed to pull her like a north star. She had not come to be praised. She had come so that children could read, so that small illnesses would be tended before they spread. She now realized that to keep working she might have to leave the place where rumor found such fast footing. She had no hate in her heart, only a clear-eyed assessment that there are seasons for staying and seasons for moving on. Father Julian cleared his throat and the square stiffened around his voice. He did not begin with the acrimony the crowd expected. He began with something older and colder, facts. He put forth what he had seen, the incision, the bandage, the manner of care, without color or embellishment. He did not violate the confessional. He spoke instead of evidence and of the nature of wounds that can be tended and healed. He used words that did not inflame and that could not be turned into slander. The sheriff listened, his jaw working. The town listened, many of the faces tight with the old habit of leaping to judgment. A few mouths unmoved, swayed with the priest's steady cadence. The whisper, for the moment, hung like mist, and could still be breathed through. Yet the mountain does not allow for easy resolutions. Even when truth is spoken, the aftertaste of rumor lingers like resin on skin. Faces in the square began to divide not into absolutes, but into small lines of preference. Some would hold to the old certainty of the whisper, others would wait for the sheriff to choose meaningfully. The town had not yet decided whether mercy was the easier or harder path. Inside the small cell, Isaac sat and rolled the satchel between his hands, feeling the weight of the cloth. He did not rail at the world. He thought of the children's faces he had glimpsed at the mission before dawn. He thought of the boy who had learned his letters and whose small triumph had been like a lantern. Isaac knew the town was brittle, knew how quickly kindness could become accusation when seen out of context. He had no suggestion of entitlement. He only wanted to be left to his life and the quiet work that gave it shape. And yet, as the sheriff's steps approached, he straightened. He had not expected the cell to become a contest of ideals. He had expected only the simple measure of someone doing what needed to be done. He did not know whether he would be released, or whether the town's need for a clear narrative would be satisfied at his expense. As the sheriff opened the door, the cold slipped in like a blade. The two men looked at one another. For a moment, nothing more than the ridge's air stood between them. This was a place on the brink, not of lawlessness but of moral fracture. The village balanced on that thin edge because longer hardships had worn patience thin. A single whisper had come down the pass and found ready fuel in an anxious people. What would come next would be determined by small acts that cost a good deal: the courage to speak truth, the humility to admit error, the willingness to let mercy be louder than rumor. Father Julian stepped down from the chapel's worn steps and headed for the place where the people gathered again, his truth like a small lamp in a wind that wanted to scatter it. Elena, in the mission's quiet, packed a small sack, books, the spare shawl, her satchel of medicines. She did not intend to vanish from the world as someone fleeing shame. She intended to go where her work would not be encumbered by the town's need to find a villain. She would not leave as a defeated thing. She would leave as someone refusing to allow rumor to define her. The crowd waited. The ridge held its breath. The whisper had turned into a murmur that moved like a pebble rolling down a slope. It had started small, and now it might cause an avalanche. Men and women who had come together in the bone-deep cold of worry found their faces set, their mouths forming judgments faster than hearts could weigh them. Isaac walked out of the cell when Sheriff Rourke's hand was extended. The sheriff did not make a grand declaration. He offered a low apology, more private than public, and he asked Isaac to consider staying within reach should his presence be necessary for further questioning. The apology was not a triumph. It was a small admission that the sheriff had felt the town's pressure and had let it shepherd his decisions. In the square, Father Julian's modest words had not undone the whisper, but they had given it a place to land that was not purely destructive. The town was not yet rebuilt. The fissures remained. Yet there was now a possibility, a space in which truth and mercy could be weighed. Elena shouldered her small sack. She looked once more toward the ridge, toward the path she had walked that morning. A thin line of sun crossed the peaks, and the light struck the scar as if to draw a map across her leg, one that would not be hidden. She did not flinch. As she stepped from the mission into the road, people did not rush to embrace her. Most found the gesture uncomfortable. Most had become practiced at the quickness of judgment, but not all. A woman who had been quiet in the crowd asked for a word with her, whispered thanks and a story about a parched throat a stranger had once soothed, and Elena felt the small, true things that keep a village from being reduced to rumor. Those small things were like stitches. They were not always enough, but they were necessary. At the top of the ridge a single whisper hung, not yet blown to fragments. It had set in motion a sequence of events that would test more than one conscience. It had asked of the village something costly, to hold its ire in check, to let facts breathe, to allow mercy space. The village, fragile though it might be, had been offered an opportunity to remake itself, or to harden further against what it could not easily understand. The mountain wind answered with a sound that was close to a laugh and close to a sigh. The day was not yet decided. The square still hummed with debate. Isaac walked back across reclaimed ground to the place where he had been accused. Father Julian prepared a path of facts and witness and hope. Elena lifted her head toward the road she would take. In the hush between the wind and the far-off bell of the chapel, there remained one small stubborn thing, a truth visible on flesh and linen, an incision healed into the promise of recovery, a bandage still fresh enough to be read by anyone willing to see. It was a proof that could not be wholly consumed by gossip, and yet proof is only part of a cure. The rest of the work would be done in words and in the slow rebuilding of trust. The whisper had been the spark. Whether it would kindle only anger or be extinguished by reason and mercy depended on those who now held the town's few levers of authority, and on the quiet courage of a few who would speak when silence had been the easier choice. From the ridge, the whisper would go on for hours, then days, and perhaps it would thin, but it would leave its mark, like frost on a windowpane, delicate, not easily erased. The village, for all its precariousness, had not yet collapsed. It teetered, yes, but the tilt could be corrected by hands willing to do the small, unglamorous labor of repair. Eleanor took her first steps down the road as a woman who knew that leaving was not the same as fleeing. She left because the work she loved demanded a landscape where children could learn without the dark press of rumor at their doors. She left because dignity was not an adornment, but a condition of life. Behind her, the village watched. Ahead of her, the path wound down to places where rumor might melt into anonymity, and where her quiet work could continue. Father Julian stayed in the square long enough to see faces soften, to hear apologies made in low voices, to note which neighbors would come to the mission with jars of stew and which would not. He had not saved the town. He had offered a choice. That, too, was a form of mercy. Sheriff Rourke returned to his ledger with a new, reluctant humility. He had learned that being a keeper of order required more than protecting property. It required protecting reputations and being wary of the speed at which people want resolution. He walked the ridge's line that afternoon, thinking of his brother's quiet, and a small restraint began to live behind his eyes. On the path out of the village, Elena felt the world open in the way roads do, less a correction than a continuance. The ridge loomed behind her like an old sentinel. The single whisper that had climbed it earlier had done its work. It had revealed more than a wound. It had exposed a town's tremor, a priest's past, a sheriff's heart, a man's quiet mercy. The sun warmed her face. The bandage under her skirt was a small, honest testament. As the afternoon moved on, the mountain's long shadow grew, and the village settled into a wary twilight. People retreated to the heat of kitchens. Conversations turned to bread, to the business of surviving another hard season. The whisper still moved like a small stubborn smoke, but around it the slow work of ordinary life went on. Children did their sums, a baker kneaded dough, a mother hummed to a child who refused sleep. Night would come, and with night would come new decisions. But for now, the ridge kept watch, and the village, on the brink though it had been, had not yet fallen. It had been given a chance to listen, to learn the cost of quickness, and perhaps to measure silence against the moral wound it can open. The next morning, before the sun had fully lifted its hand over the peaks, Father Julian would have to choose the shape of his words with more care. Sheriff Rourke would have to decide whether a public statement sufficed, or whether humility demanded something more. Isaac would have to measure the town's patience and decide whether to accept the sheriff's conditional leave or to go where the work did not draw such heat. Elena would step onto a new road with the small, defined courage of someone who knows that dignity requires maintenance. The mountain would hold all these small acts within its bones, and the whisper, single and now irrevocable, would watch them unfold. Dawn the next day came thin and pale, as if the mountain itself were holding its breath to hear what would be said. The ridge's edges, rimmed in frost, caught the first gray light and sharpened into relief. Elena packed the last of her things with a slow thoroughness, folding each small object as if it were a promise she meant to keep. A slate with its chalk, a stack of worn primers, a small tin of salve. She tied her shawl twice, feeling the bandage at her thigh as a private map. The scar there was not yet a scar. It was a line that would become history on skin, a small testament to what had been done more than to what had been assumed. She walked to the square because facts, like seeds, sometimes needed the crowd to plant them. She did not seek spectacle. She sought only the plain soil of truth. The square smelled of coffee and smoke. People clustered in small knots, faces still edged by the previous night's murmurs. Some set their jaws as if bracing for a verdict. Others wore the soft uncertainty of those who had stayed up turning questions over and over until the edges had smoothed. Father Julian waited near the fountain, the sunlight catching the small white of his collar. He had not prepared a speech. He had instead worked out a purity of purpose in the quiet that morning. To speak what he had observed plainly, to name the physical facts in a voice that could be heard without being read as accusation. He thought of the boy who had died years before, and of how that memory pressed against his ribs like a guilt he could not excuse. Today, he told himself, would be an act of small redemption, an attempt to place mercy and truth back on the scales before they tipped. Isaac came out of the courthouse before the crowd froze into any comfortable formation. He walked with the casual steadiness of someone used to moving through weather without claim. He kept his hands out of his pockets. He let the satchel swing from one shoulder like an old companion. People watched him. Some watched with relief. They had wanted a villain to name and were now offered the complication of a man who had only done what needed doing. Others watched with a thin, wary anger as if the world had been deprived of a clear enemy. The town gathered in a loose ring. The square, which had seemed to cradle the rumor like a child's secret, now braced for words that might either mend or widen the fracture. A bench held a woman who had come because she could not sleep. She had seen the look on Elena's face the day before and wanted to be near the place where truth might be put down like a clean cloth. When Father Julian stepped forward, the square grew still in a way that had nothing to do with ritual and everything to do with attention. He did not speak of guilt or accuse the crowd of cruelty. He began at the simplest point. The place he had seen, the wound he had observed, the bandage he had touched. He said, "I saw an incision, I saw clean work, I saw a bandage placed with care." His voice held no triumph. It only held what his eyes had recorded, the language of flesh and of hands who know how to mend. There was a rustle among those who had come to be certain. Some heads turned as if to catch the fact and hold it under their palms. The blacksmith, who had been sharpest the night before, pressed his lips tightly. The old hurt in him did not leave at once. Yet Father Julian continued, and his words burned with a small steady heat. He recalled the way the wound bled there, and how the linen bore the grit of the ridge. He spoke of how a man with a blade can pull out a hazard and wrap the place so infection does not take root. He said what an incision and a dressing can say to anyone who will look. This was care, not assault. Not everyone in the square listened like the sun. Curiosity and stubbornness do not vanish upon hearing. They shift or harden. A few voices tried to shape the priest's steady facts into a counter-argument, but the number of those voices thinned as more people gave weight to what had been plainly visible. Sister Clara stood nearby, her hands clasped and tired from watching a friend be wounded twice, once in body, once by rumor. Her eyes found Elena in the crowd and held a compassionate, unspoken promise. Sheriff Rourke had to stand where his duty could be seen. He walked to the center because the town needed someone to translate words into action, and because he had learned the hard lesson that private remorse did not always settle the public ledger. His steps were measured. When he spoke, he did not make a show of law. He said simply, "We moved too quickly. We let a picture become a verdict before hearing the story. Isaac Calder will not be held. He is free to go." The words were a release and an admission folded into one. The admission landed with an odd sound, not the crack of a gavel, but the sigh of a community caught in the middle of its own beginnings. Some in the crowd nodded with relief. Others clapped with the brittle quickness of those who feel vindicated. A few mouths remained tight with the wrestler's refusal to yield. Sheriff Rourke did not try to win applause. He stood with the look of a man who had carried weights and chosen, in that moment, to set one down. Elena stepped forward then. The crowd turned, as if the axis of the morning had been her quiet courage. She did not shout. She simply told the story again in the plain currency of fact. How she had slipped, how the splinter had lodged, how she had asked for help, how Isaac had removed the hazard, how he had bound the wound. She said it without rancor, without theatrical pain, because the dignity she carried did not need the world to witness her suffering to make it valid. Her voice trembled once and then steadied like a bell set to ring true. A woman in the back began to weep softly. Another man let his forehead go into his hands in apology he could not speak aloud. The blacksmith stepped forward awkwardly and placed a small coin in the priest's hat, an offering that was less for the church than for the idea that had been bruised and might be mended. These were small acts of repair, food brought to the mission, a promise from a neighbor to fix a fence, a child allowed to play in the open again. Trust is rebuilt in small increments. Father Julian's eyes met the sheriff's, and in that glance there was a gratitude that was not showy. The man who had once let silence become a sentence had done what he could to make amends. But even as the town took steps toward repair, Father Julian knew the harder task. Speaking truth was necessary, but it did not erase the wound left behind by suspicion. He walked among the people quietly, greeting those willing to be greeted, pressing into hands the sense that mercy could be practiced as concretely as binding a thigh. The day moved forward with the slow grace of those who have chosen repair over revenge. Isaac lingered in the square after others had gone to their chores. He spoke to a few who would listen, not to boast or to gain favor, but to place the facts where they might settle. He told of the way the ridge tucks secrets, and the way a passerby's shadow can be read as a deed. He made light of the cell as if it were a bench where he had taken a short rest. He did not ask for apologies. He welcomed them when they came, acknowledging with a quiet that sometimes receiving an apology helps more than asking for one. Still, not everything was mended. Inside the mission, small acts of kindness were given with the knowledge that not every hand would offer them. Elena packed a parcel quietly, some primers, a bundle of folded page proofs she meant to leave with Sister Clara, a few coins for the traveling fare. She had thought long into the night about where to go. It is one kind of courage to remain and repair. It is another to step away when staying will make the work harder. She had come to the ridge to teach. She would go on to teach elsewhere because she believed gentleness must have room to breathe. Sister Clara helped her fasten the parcels, her fingers moving with the slow, exact motions of one who has mended both garments and spirits. They said what needed to be said in small phrases, no speeches, only the language of companions. Go where they will not see your skin as a scandal. Take with you our prayers and the children's chants. Come back if the work calls you. The blessings were not grand, but they were enough. When Elena left that afternoon, the village watched from doorways. Some faces were warmed by shame, converted into action. Others were still cool with the residue of suspicion. She did not leave in sorrow alone. She left with the steady ballast of someone who would not allow rumor to name the shape of her life. She took the ridge one last time in her eyes, and the mountains seemed to acknowledge her departure with a wind that lifted the hem of her shawl and pressed it gently to her shoulders. Isaac considered his own options. The sheriff's conditional leave had been an invitation not to vanish, but to remain within reach should further need arise. Isaac thought of staying, of becoming part of the small scaffolding that would help the town regain its center. He also thought of the ridge and of places farther off where his quiet work would be less likely to be misread. In the end, he did not choose exile or grand staying. He chose the slower work. He remained in reach, coming to the mission sometimes to deliver a mended hinge or a parcel, to help where he could, and to let the people's trust rebuild under his steady, unassuming presence. Time, in the days that followed, stitched the small wounds that rumor had torn. Not every grin returned, not every neighbor forgot the ease with which they had believed the worst. But there were signs. A child played without being hauled inside at the whisper of gossip. A woman who had stood fastest in condemnation brought a pot of stew to the mission with hands that shook and eyes that said apology without words. A younger man, new to town and therefore less browned by its old quarrels, began to volunteer at the school, and his fresh energy felt like a quiet answer to the ugly sound of rumor. Father Julian continued to preach the small gospel of care, not a denunciation of those who erred, but a steady invitation to consider where silence had done harm and where speech might still heal. He did not become a zealot for speaking at all times. He simply worked to remind his flock that some silence protects sacred trust, but other silence feeds rot. He taught through actions as much as words, tending to the sick, visiting the lonely, asking hard questions when someone's reputation was at stake. Sheriff Rourke found himself awake at odd hours, thinking of what had passed. He walked his rounds with a different gait, listening longer to the stories of his neighbors. When a new rumor began to fester about a trader bringing in cheap cloth, he refused to lob it into the square for judgment. He insisted on inquiry. He made a point, perhaps small, perhaps too late to be noble, of visiting the mission more frequently, carrying with him not just the ledger, but an ear that listened before acting. The village's economy did not mend overnight. Crops were still thin, and the cough still moved through some houses. But the way the community faced those troubles shifted. Where once people had sought someone to blame for discomfort, they now began, in small ways, to reach across the gap. That change came haltingly, sometimes in fits and starts, but enough that by the time Elena had walked a day's road into the next valley, she received a parcel, a small stack of readers her students had written, their crude letters forming sentences of gratitude. The parcel was the village's way of saying that repair had begun, and that it did not require the dramatic absolution of all hearts at once, only steady reknitting. Elena's path took her through towns where the mountain's shadow stretched long, and where other lives waited for the quiet work she knew how to do. She taught in a schoolhouse warmed by a pot-bellied stove. She patched torn pages and mended more than clothing. She helped make room for children to find language to name sorrow and to learn the discipline of fact. Every now and then she pressed her hand to the bandage's eventual scar just below her skirt where it had set into a pale crescent. The mark there was personal and non-theatrical. It indicated not suffering performed, but a life continued. Isaac sometimes passed by the mission in the cooler months with a pair of repaired harnesses or a gift of smoked meat. He did not come to be acclaimed. He came because small kindnesses were its own reward and because he had learned that being nearby matters when a community rebuilds trust. When the men at the blacksmith shop teased him with broad, good-natured jests about being the man who had been briefly jailed for saving a lady, Isaac only smiled with the subdued humor of someone who knows how stories bend. At the mission, Sister Clara taught the children new songs that had nothing to do with scandal and everything to do with endurance. Tunes about bread rising, about the patience of roots, about trees that weather storms and keep their rings. The songs were small rituals of resilience. They taught that life is not measured by episodes of accusation, but by the steady work of care. The ridge kept watch over the village like a patient elder. Seasons turned, bringing snow that muffled voices until even the whispering slowed. When the thaw came, the paths reappeared, a reminder that erosion and repair share the same geography. The memory of the single whisper did not vanish. It remained like a sound that would never be entirely blotted out, a caution in the town's ear. But its power diminished when faced with the steady, mundane acts of neighborliness. Weeks later, a small festival was held to mark the end of the planting's hardest phase. It was not a grand celebration. It was an evening where bread was shared and children performed lines they had learned in school. Elena's absence was noticed and felt, but not as a wound, rather as the quiet result of a choice to let truth be larger than rumor. A small space had opened in the village where people could name their mistakes and ask for repair without the theater of public spectacle. In the hush after the festival, Father Julian stood on the mission's porch watching the stars come out one by one above the serrated mouth of the ridge. He had seen what a single silence had cost him. He had tasted the small redemption that speaking the truth, plain and sober, had offered his people. He pressed his hand to the rosary at his wrist and felt the beads like small anchors. He did not imagine every heart would change overnight, but he trusted that courage, once exercised, tends to grow. Sheriff Rourke found himself walking home by the river later than he used to, thinking less of crimes to punish and more of wounds to prevent. His brother's memory had softened from a raw cut to a lesson that guided him like a lantern. When someone in the market began to lean into rumor, he stepped close and asked a question, simple, steadying, a habit that sometimes arrests haste. What did you see? What else might be true? The shift was nothing dramatic. It was the work of a town learning to ask before condemning. The whisper had changed. It no longer functioned as the engine of communal judgment, but as a reminder to listen more closely. Parents taught children that seeing is not the same as knowing. Elders reminded neighbors to let facts breathe. The village did not cease to be fragile, but it became in small ways less likely to break when wind blew. Years later, Elena returned once to the ridge, not to live but to stand and see. She walked a short way up the path and rested on a low stone, the bandage long since a pale line under the skin. Children she had once taught had children of their own now. She read names and bits of sentences in letters sent from those she had kept in touch with. The mission had its jars of stew and its repaired porch, small things which proved that repair can persist when people choose it. From the top of the ridge she looked back at the town, a collection of roofs and chimneys framed by the mountain's hands. The wind there carried many sounds, the clack of a cart's wheels, a dog's distant bark, the low shouts of men mending a fence. The whisper that once climbed like a single ruinous thread had been overtaken by the wear of ordinary life. It had not disappeared. Its memory lived in the way neighbors now paused before they spoke. That pause, more than any sermon, had become the town's new safeguard. Elena tucked the book she had been carrying under her arm and rose. She did not feel triumphant. She felt quieter and more rooted in the knowledge that dignity is not restored by triumphs alone, but by the patient work of truth and mercy. She had left, and the village had begun again. Each had cost the other something, and each had been asked to take on the burden of learning. As she stepped down, the light slipped across the peaks and made the ridge look like an old map, where paths became choices and scars were landmarks. The mountain breathed in the late afternoon and let out a small, steady gust that picked up a whisper and set it to traveling. Only now the whisper had a different timbre, harder one, softer, lined with the memory of what nearly went wrong. It asked, not for certainty, but for care. If this story resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who needs a reminder that truth matters and that the courage to speak, timely and measured, can protect the vulnerable and mend what a rumor would tear apart.